It was one of those evenings when the air felt heavy with unspoken emotions, the kind that lingered between strangers and acquaintances alike. A cozy little restaurant on the corner of Maple Street buzzed with the quiet hum of soft jazz and the occasional clinking of cutlery. The place was dimly lit, casting warm, golden hues over tables adorned with crisp white linens and neatly folded napkins. It was here, in this seemingly ordinary setting, that an extraordinary story was about to unfold. A young man sat at a corner table, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering candlelight. His name wasn't important. What mattered was the air of confidence he exuded. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he had the look of someone who believed the world revolved around him. His smirk was as sharp as his attire, the kind of expression that hinted at a certain superiority. Across from him, a young woman quietly sipped her water, her posture calm and composed despite the tension in the air. Her demeanor was unassuming, almost too ordinary for someone sitting across from a man who clearly loved being the center of attention. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She didn't seem intimidated by the man's flashy confidence or his patronizing tone, which had already drawn a few sideways glances from nearby diners. If anything, she appeared unfazed, her gaze steady and unwavering. The conversation started innocuously enough, with polite exchanges about the menu and casual remarks about the ambience. But then, something shifted. The man leaned forward, his smirk widening as he made an offhand comment that landed like a slap in the face. "You know," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "it's surprising to see someone like you here. You don't really seem like the type for places like this. A bit out of your league, wouldn't you say?" The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. A few heads turned, and the low murmur of the room seemed to falter for a moment. The young woman didn't flinch. She set her glass down carefully, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. "Oh," she replied, her tone as smooth as silk. "And what type would that be?" The man chuckled, clearly relishing the attention. "Well, you know," he said, gesturing vaguely, "this isn't exactly a fast food joint. Places like this are for people who belong. And let's just say you don't quite give off that vibe." It was the kind of insult that was meant to wound, delivered with a veneer of casual humor. But the woman didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression that was hard to read. Was it amusement? Curiosity? Whatever it was, it seemed to unnerve him just a little. "And what vibe do you think I give off?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of something else, something that made the man's confident facade falter ever so slightly. He hesitated, as though realizing too late that he might have underestimated her. But he recovered quickly, flashing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, I don't know," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Just not this." The tension in the room was palpable now, the kind that made people lean a little closer to their tables, pretending not to eavesdrop while hanging on every word. The young woman leaned back in her chair, her smile widening just enough to show that she wasn't offended. If anything, she seemed intrigued. "Well," she said, her voice carrying just enough weight to command attention, "I suppose it's easy to make assumptions about people when you don't know their story." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Story?" he echoed, his tone skeptical. "What story?" "Everyone has a story, but not everyone's is worth listening to." Her eyes sparkled, and for the first time, her calm facade seemed to crack, revealing a glimmer of something deeper, something powerful. "Oh, you're absolutely right," she said, her voice steady but with an edge that sent a ripple through the room. "Not every story is worth listening to. But some stories can change everything." The man's smirk faltered again, and for a moment, he looked genuinely unsettled. Before he could respond, the waiter appeared at their table, breaking the tension. The woman glanced up and thanked the waiter with a warm smile, as though the heated exchange had never happened. The man, however, was visibly rattled, his confidence shaken in a way that didn't go unnoticed by those nearby. As the waiter walked away, the man cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain his composure. So, it was one of those evenings when the air felt heavy with unspoken emotions, the kind that lingered between strangers and acquaintances alike. A cozy little restaurant on the corner of Maple Street buzzed with the quiet hum of soft jazz and the occasional clinking of cutlery. The place was dimly lit, casting warm, golden hues over tables adorned with crisp white linens and neatly folded napkins. It was here, in this seemingly ordinary setting, that an extraordinary story was about to unfold. A young man sat at a corner table, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering candlelight. His name wasn't important. What mattered was the air of confidence he exuded. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he had the look of someone who believed the world revolved around him. His smirk was as sharp as his attire, the kind of expression that hinted at a certain superiority. Across from him, a young woman quietly sipped her water, her posture calm and composed despite the tension in the air. Her demeanor was unassuming, almost too ordinary for someone sitting across from a man who clearly loved being the center of attention. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She didn't seem intimidated by the man's flashy confidence or his patronizing tone, which had already drawn a few sideways glances from nearby diners. If anything, she appeared unfazed, her gaze steady and unwavering. The conversation started innocuously enough, with polite exchanges about the menu and casual remarks about the ambience. But then, something shifted. The man leaned forward, his smirk widening as he made an offhand comment that landed like a slap in the face. "You know," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "it's surprising to see someone like you here. You don't really seem like the type for places like this. A bit out of your league, wouldn't you say?" The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. A few heads turned, and the low murmur of the room seemed to falter for a moment. The young woman didn't flinch. She set her glass down carefully, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. "Oh," she replied, her tone as smooth as silk. "And what type would that be?" The man chuckled, clearly relishing the attention. "Well, you know," he said, gesturing vaguely. "This isn't exactly a fast food joint. Places like this are for people who belong. And let's just say you don't quite give off that vibe." It was the kind of insult that was meant to wound, delivered with a veneer of casual humor. But the woman didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression that was hard to read. Was it amusement? Curiosity? Whatever it was, it seemed to unnerve him just a little. "And what vibe do you think I give off?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of something else. Something that made the man's confident facade falter ever so slightly. He hesitated, as though realizing too late that he might have underestimated her. But he recovered quickly, flashing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, I don't know," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Just not this." The tension in the room was palpable now, the kind that made people lean a little closer to their tables, pretending not to eavesdrop while hanging on every word. The young woman leaned back in her chair, her smile widening just enough to show that she wasn't offended. If anything, she seemed intrigued. "Well," she said, her voice carrying just enough weight to command attention, "I suppose it's easy to make assumptions about people when you don't know their story." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Story?" he echoed, his tone skeptical. "What story? Everyone has a story, but not everyone's is worth listening to." Her eyes sparkled, and for the first time, her calm facade seemed to crack, revealing a glimmer of something deeper, something powerful. "Oh, you're absolutely right," she said, her voice steady, but with an edge that sent a ripple through the room. "Not every story is worth listening to, but some stories can change everything." The man's smirk faltered again, and for a moment, he looked genuinely unsettled. Before he could respond, the waiter appeared at their table, breaking the tension. The woman glanced up, and thanked the waiter with a warm smile, as though the heated exchange had never happened. The man, however, was visibly rattled, his confidence shaken in a way that didn't go unnoticed by those nearby. He said, forcing a casual tone, "What's your story then, since you seem so sure it's worth listening to?" The woman's smile didn't waver. If anything, it grew, but there was something almost enigmatic about it now. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto his. "Oh, I could tell you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm not sure you're ready for it." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to push further. The man stared at her, his confidence now teetering on the edge of something he couldn't quite name. And just as he opened his mouth to respond, the sound of a phone buzzing on the table interrupted them. It was hers. She glanced at the screen, and for a split second, her expression shifted. Something unspoken flickered in her eyes. She stood abruptly, her calm demeanor replaced with urgency. "I have to go," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "But maybe you'll find out the truth someday." Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving the man and everyone else in the room to wonder what just happened, and why they suddenly couldn't shake the feeling that they'd witnessed the beginning of something far bigger than they could comprehend. The man sat there for a moment, stunned into silence. He wasn't used to being left in the middle of a conversation, much less by someone he thought he had the upper hand on. The restaurant buzzed on around him, but he felt strangely isolated, as though the world had shifted slightly out of focus. Her sudden departure had left a gaping hole in the evening's narrative, and he hated loose ends. He stared at her half-empty glass of water, his mind racing to piece together what had just happened. There was something about her, something he couldn't put his finger on. Her words lingered in his mind, especially the way she'd said, "Maybe you'll find out the truth someday." The truth about what? What was it she wasn't telling him? As he reached for his own glass, he realized his hands were trembling slightly. He clenched his fists, annoyed at the reaction. It wasn't like him to feel this unsettled, especially over someone he barely knew. She was just a stranger after all, someone he'd met through a casual introduction at a friend's gathering a week ago. She wasn't supposed to leave him feeling like this, like the ground beneath his feet was no longer steady. "Excuse me," a voice said, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was the waiter, hovering politely by the table. "Would you like to see the dessert menu, or should I bring the check?" He blinked, realizing how long he'd been sitting there, lost in his thoughts. "The check," he said quickly, his voice sharper than he intended. The waiter nodded and disappeared, leaving him alone once more. As he waited, he pulled out his phone, scrolling aimlessly through his messages. But even the stream of notifications and group chats couldn't distract him from the nagging feeling that he'd missed something important. His mind kept circling back to her calm, almost cryptic demeanor, the way she'd walked out without a hint of hesitation. When the waiter returned with the check, he paid quickly and left, stepping out into the cool night air. The city was alive with its usual energy, cars honking, people laughing as they passed by, the faint hum of music spilling out from nearby bars. But none of it seemed to register. He stood there on the sidewalk, glancing in the direction she'd gone. It wouldn't be hard to track her down if he wanted to. He had her number after all, and a quick search on social media would probably give him more than enough information. But something held him back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the sense that chasing her down would only make him look desperate. Instead, he started walking, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. As he moved through the bustling streets, his mind replayed their conversation over and over, dissecting every word, every expression. Who was she, really? And why did he feel like she was playing a game he didn't know the rules to? Over the next few days, he couldn't shake the encounter. It lingered in the back of his mind, creeping into his thoughts at the most unexpected moments. He found himself going over every detail he remembered about her, the way she carried herself, the subtle confidence in her voice, the way she looked at him like she knew something he didn't. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He decided to do a little digging, not enough to be obvious, but just enough to satisfy the nagging questions in his mind. A quick search of her name led him to her social media profiles, which were surprisingly sparse. She wasn't one of those people who documented every moment of their life online. Most of her posts were years old, and even those revealed little more than a love for books and a few scenic photos from what looked like hiking trips. There was one thing, though, that caught his attention. Among her few posts was a picture of a man, older, maybe in his late 50s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. The caption read simply, "In memory." The date on the post was 3 years ago. He stared at the photo for a long time, feeling a strange sense of unease. Who was the man? Her father? A mentor? He couldn't tell, but something about the way she'd worded the caption made it clear that whoever he was, he'd been important to her. As he delved deeper, he found himself drawn to the mystery of her life. There were so many gaps, so many unanswered questions. It was as though she deliberately curated her presence to reveal only what she wanted others to see. And the more he learned, or didn't learn, the more he realized how little he actually knew about her. His curiosity soon turned into an obsession. He started noticing small things he hadn't before, offhand comments she'd made, the way she'd reacted to certain topics. He even found himself returning to the restaurant where they'd met, hoping to run into her again. But each visit ended in disappointment. One evening, as he sat at the same corner table they'd shared, nursing a drink and staring out the window, he overheard a conversation at the next table that made his heart skip a beat. "Yeah, I saw her the other day," one of the diners was saying. "She's been volunteering at the shelter downtown. You know, the one near the park." His ears perked up. Could they be talking about her? It seemed too coincidental, but then again, he'd learned by now that coincidences had a way of leading to unexpected truths. The next day, he found himself standing outside the shelter, feeling a little ridiculous. What was he even doing here? It wasn't like he had a plan. He told himself he was just curious, that he wanted to understand her better. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. As he stepped inside, the sound of laughter and chatter greeted him. The place was bustling with activity. Volunteers handing out meals, kids running around, and people sitting at tables, sharing stories and smiles. And then, amid the chaos, he saw her. She was standing by a table, helping an elderly woman with her meal. Her face was lit up with a genuine smile, the kind he hadn't seen during their brief encounter at the restaurant. For a moment, he just watched her, trying to reconcile this version of her with the poised, enigmatic woman he'd met before. She looked up suddenly, as though sensing his presence. Their eyes met across the room, and for a split second, he saw a flicker of surprise in her expression. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by the same calm composure she'd shown before. She made her way over to him, her steps unhurried. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone neutral but with a hint of curiosity. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, trying to sound casual. She raised an eyebrow. "I volunteer here. What's your excuse?" He hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "I heard you might be here," he admitted finally. "I wanted to talk." Her expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes, something that made him feel like she was seeing right through him. "Talk about what?" He opened his mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain the way she'd been haunting his thoughts, the way he couldn't let go of the mystery surrounding her? Before he could figure out what to say, she smiled faintly and gestured toward an empty table. "All right," she said. "Let's talk." As they sat down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into uncharted territory, that whatever answers he found here might only lead to more questions, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth, or if the truth was ready for him. The table between them felt unusually large, a silent barrier that neither of them attempted to cross. She sat down slowly, eyes still locked onto his as if waiting for him to make the first move. He cleared his throat, trying to gather his thoughts, but the tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. "So, you volunteer here," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "How long have you been doing this?" "Long enough," she replied, her tone calm and unruffled. She glanced around the room briefly, her gaze sweeping over the bustling volunteers and the people they were helping. "I've been coming here for a while. It's something I do." "Why?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. He didn't know why he was pushing so hard, but something inside him needed to understand why someone like her, someone who had been so distant and enigmatic, would choose to spend their time here, in a place that felt so far removed from her world. Her eyes flickered for a moment, and he caught a glimpse of something else, something beneath her calm exterior. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that same composed expression. She folded her arms across the table, studying him. "You ask a lot of questions," she said quietly. "Maybe I'm trying to understand you," he replied, unable to mask the frustration in his voice. The mystery surrounding her was starting to gnaw at him again. Every moment he spent with her only seemed to raise more questions, and she wasn't giving him any answers. "Understand me?" She smiled slightly, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a knowing smile, the kind that made him feel like she was 2 steps ahead, always anticipating his next move. "You really think you can understand someone just like that?" "I don't know," he said, feeling the weight of her gaze press down on him. "Maybe. I think you're hiding something. Something important." Her expression shifted, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something darker, something like warning, in her eyes. "Be careful," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "Not all things are meant to be understood. Some things are better left alone." The words hung in the air like a challenge. He swallowed, his mind racing. What was she trying to say? What was she hiding? He leaned in, his impatience mounting. "I'm not here to back off, okay? I want to know who you really are. I can't just let this go." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he thought she might get up and walk away again. But she didn't. Instead, she sat there, silent, studying him with an unreadable expression. The room around them seemed to fade into the background, the noise, the people, all becoming distant echoes. All he could focus on was her, the way she looked at him, the way her presence filled the space. "You really want to know the truth?" she asked after a long, tense pause. Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it now, something that made his pulse quicken. "You really think you can handle it?" "I'm not afraid of the truth," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure he believed them. Something in her tone, in the way she said it, made him doubt everything he thought he knew. She studied him for another long moment before speaking again. "You're not ready for it. You think you are, but you're not." The words hit him like a punch, knocking the breath out of his chest. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came. She was right. He could feel it deep down, that nagging doubt that perhaps he wasn't prepared for whatever it was she was about to say. But there was no going back now. He needed answers. "Then tell me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what it is you're hiding." Her expression softened, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't the softness of someone who was about to reveal a secret. It was the softness of someone who knew they were about to shatter something, someone who understood the weight of what was coming. She exhaled slowly, her eyes lowering for a moment before meeting his again. "You think you know everything," she said quietly, "but you don't. There's more to me than what I let people see. More than you can even imagine." His heart began to race, his mind trying to make sense of the cryptic words, but they only made everything worse. What did she mean? Was there a dark secret in her past? Something so terrible that she couldn't even speak of it. For a moment, the room seemed to close in around him. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the weight of her words was slowly suffocating him. He leaned back in his chair, trying to collect himself. "So what, you're just going to leave me hanging?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly despite himself. Her lips curled into a small, almost sad smile. "I don't have to tell you everything," she said softly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." His mind reeled. Every instinct in him screamed that there was something important, something crucial, just out of reach, and it was maddening. She was playing some kind of game, and he couldn't figure out the rules. He stared at her, searching her face for any sign of what she was really thinking, but all he saw was that same mask, the calm exterior that she had perfected. It was like she was an enigma wrapped in a mystery, and the harder he tried to solve it, the more elusive she became. "You're not going to tell me," he said, more to himself than to her. His voice was low, almost bitter now. "So what's the point of all this? Why did you even agree to meet me?" Her smile faded, and for the first time, she looked almost weary, like this wasn't something she wanted to do, but something she had to. "Because you wouldn't leave it alone," she said softly, "and you needed to hear it from me." He shook his head in frustration. "Hear what? What's so important that you can't even say it?" She stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor. The shift in her movement was jarring, and before he could react, she was walking toward the door, her back straight, her footsteps purposeful. She didn't look back at him. "Wait," he called, standing up quickly. "Where are you going?" But she didn't answer. She paused just before the door, her hand resting on the handle. For a brief moment, she looked back over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "The truth is, some things are better left unsaid. And some things, well, they'll come to you when you're ready." And with that, she was gone. The door swung shut behind her, leaving him standing in the middle of the room, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and frustration. What had just happened? What was she trying to tell him? Was he really ready for whatever truth she was holding back? And if not, would he ever be? The questions lingered, unanswered, as the weight of her departure settled over him like a dark cloud. He stood there for a long moment, the weight of her words echoing in his mind. Some things were better left unsaid, she had told him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something more, something much darker, was lurking just beneath the surface, something she wasn't telling him. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but it wasn't just the unanswered questions that kept him rooted to the spot. It was the sense that the truth was close, so close he could almost reach out and touch it. But every time he tried, it slipped away like sand through his fingers. His mind raced. Could she be playing him? Was she deliberately keeping him in the dark? The more he thought about it, the more everything about her, her calm demeanor, her cryptic words, her sudden departure, felt like a carefully constructed puzzle, one he hadn't even begun to solve. It wasn't until later that evening, as he sat in his apartment, staring out at the city lights, that he realized how much he had underestimated her. She wasn't just a mystery. She was dangerous in ways he hadn't even begun to comprehend. The sound of his phone vibrating on the coffee table pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, expecting to see a text from a friend or some random notification. But instead, it was an unknown number. His stomach twisted uneasily. It could be her, or maybe someone else, someone who knew something he didn't. He answered, his voice steady but unsure. "Hello." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a low, unfamiliar voice. "You don't know who I am, but I think you need to hear this." His heart skipped a beat. Who is this? "Let's just say I'm someone who knows a lot more about her than you think." The voice continued, its tone laced with a strange urgency. "And if you think what she told you was the truth, you're gravely mistaken." The words hit him like a punch. His mind raced. Who was this? How did they know anything about her? "What are you talking about?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "Who is she really? What's going on?" The voice on the other end seemed to hesitate, and for a brief moment, he wondered if the call was a prank. But then the voice spoke again, this time with a cold, unsettling clarity. "You need to stop looking for her. Stop asking questions, because if you keep digging, you'll find yourself in a place you can't come back from." The words lingered in the air, sending a chill down his spine. It wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. A threat that made it clear he had already crossed some line he didn't even know existed. But what was he supposed to do? Walk away? Forget everything that had happened? Before he could respond, the line went dead. The eerie silence that followed was deafening. And for a moment, he just stood there, staring at the phone, trying to process what had just happened. The mystery deepened, but so did the danger. Whoever this person was, they clearly knew something about her. Something he hadn't even begun to grasp. His mind flashed back to the things she had said, the way she had looked at him before she left. The cryptic words, the strange sense of finality in her departure. Had she known something was coming? Had she been trying to warn him without actually saying it? But before he could get any further in his thoughts, his phone buzzed again, this time with a text. He opened it without thinking, but the message wasn't from her. It was a single sentence, short and to the point. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th. Tonight. His heart raced. Who was this? What did they want? The cryptic message only made the situation even more complicated. And yet, something told him he couldn't ignore it. This could be the breakthrough he needed, the piece of the puzzle that would finally make sense of everything. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. He didn't know what he was walking into. But there was no turning back now. The stakes were higher than ever, and he could feel it in his bones. This was no longer just about a strange encounter in a restaurant. It was about uncovering a truth that had been carefully hidden, and it was about to get much, much more dangerous. As he drove toward the warehouse district, his mind churned with possibilities. The building was old, abandoned, with shattered windows and peeling paint, a perfect place to hide secrets. And yet, as he parked his car and stepped into the cold night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't the only one who had been lured there. The city felt quieter than usual, as though the whole world was holding its breath. He approached the warehouse cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. There was no sign of life, no lights, no movement, nothing to indicate that anyone else was there. But something in the back of his mind told him that wasn't the case. Someone was watching him, waiting. When he reached the door, it creaked open with a push, revealing a dark interior. The shadows seemed to swallow the room, making it impossible to see anything clearly. He hesitated for a moment, his senses heightened, but then he stepped inside, his breath coming faster as the uncertainty built within him. And then, just as he was about to take another step, a voice came from the darkness. "You came." He froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was hers. But something about the way she said it sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't the calm, measured tone he had heard before. This was different. This was almost cold. "Why am I here?" he asked, his voice low, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is this? What do you want from me?" The shadows shifted, and from the darkness emerged a figure. Her silhouette was unmistakable, but her posture was different, more rigid, more distant than before. And the expression on her face, it wasn't the calm mask he had seen in the restaurant. It was something darker, something that suggested she had been playing a much deeper game all along. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have come, but now that you're here, I guess it's time you knew the truth." His breath caught in his throat. The truth. The one he had been searching for, the one that had been driving him to this moment. But as she spoke those words, something in her eyes, something cold, something calculating, told him he wasn't ready for the answer. And whatever he was about to learn, it was going to change everything. The tension in the air was unbearable. He could feel it, thick and suffocating, pressing down on him from all sides. But even as the truth seemed within reach, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was only just beginning. The dim light flickered above them, casting long shadows across the empty warehouse floor. He could feel the tension tightening around them like a noose, and yet there was something undeniably magnetic about the woman standing in front of him, her eyes cold but purposeful. Every instinct in his body screamed to run, but his feet were rooted to the ground, drawn to her like a moth to a flame. "You shouldn't have come here," she repeated, her voice softer now, but still tinged with something that made his skin crawl. "But now that you are, there's no going back." His mind raced. What was she talking about? What was the truth she was about to reveal? He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, and a cold sweat began to form on his forehead. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was something much bigger, something dangerous. "Tell me," he demanded, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound firm. "Tell me what this is. What's going on? Who are you really?" She took a slow, deliberate step closer, and for a moment, the silence between them was deafening. He could hear the distant hum of the city outside, the only noise in the otherwise still air. But she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she seemed to study him, as if trying to gauge his reaction. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "I told you before," she said. "You don't know who I am, and you don't know who you are either." The words hit him like a punch. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his heart beginning to race again. "What are you trying to say?" Her eyes darkened, and a slow, unsettling smile spread across her face. "I'm not the one you should be worried about. You're the one who's been living a lie all this time." He blinked, trying to process what she was saying. A lie. His voice cracked slightly, and the unease in his chest deepened. "What are you talking about?" She took another step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "You think you know everything about yourself. You think you've got it all figured out. But the truth is, your entire life has been manipulated. You've been a pawn in a game you didn't even know you were playing." A rush of confusion swept over him. His mind raced to connect the dots, but they refused to align. "No," he said, shaking his head. "That doesn't make any sense." "I don't." "You're not who you think you are," she interrupted, her voice sharp now, her words cutting through the air. "Everything you've been told, everything you've believed, it's all part of a carefully constructed illusion. Your past, your family, it's all been fabricated." He felt the ground shift beneath him, like the very foundation of his life was crumbling away. "That's impossible," he whispered. I have memories. I have a family. Memories are easily manipulated," she said, her voice cold and final. "Your family, the people you trust, they're not who you think they are. They're not even your real family." The room seemed to close in around him. His legs felt weak, his vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. Everything he thought he knew, the life he had built, the relationships he had with the people closest to him, was built on a lie. The words echoed in his mind, spinning in dizzying circles. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his question. Then, in a voice that sent a shiver down his spine, she answered, "I'm not doing anything. I'm just showing you the truth. What you do with it is up to you." His mind was reeling, struggling to process the enormity of what she was saying. But before he could ask another question, she raised a hand, silencing him. Her eyes softened for a brief moment, but the edge of warning still lingered. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said. "You're not the only one looking for answers. There are people out there who've been watching you. People who know who you really are, and they won't stop until they find you." The air in the warehouse seemed to grow colder, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He wanted to ask more, to demand explanations, but something in her gaze told him it was too late for questions. The truth had already been set in motion, and there was no going back. He turned toward the door, his mind spinning, desperate to escape the suffocating tension in the room. But before he could take a step, a sound from behind him froze him in place. Footsteps. Rapid, deliberate footsteps. He spun around just in time to see two figures emerging from the shadows, their faces obscured by darkness. One of them was holding something, a small, sleek device in their hand. It glowed faintly, casting an eerie light on their faces. The woman standing in front of him didn't flinch. In fact, she didn't move at all, as if this was all part of the plan. "I told you," she said quietly, her voice almost soothing now. "There's no escaping it. You've been marked." The two figures advanced toward him, their movements calculated, purposeful. His heart pounded in his chest, and panic surged through his veins. Who were they? What did they want? "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice shaky. "I don't know what you want, but I don't even know who I am anymore." One of the figures stepped forward, their face finally visible in the dim light. The last thing he expected was to see a face he recognized, someone he thought was long gone, someone he never imagined would be part of this. It was someone from his past, someone he thought had been lost to time. The shock hit him like a wave, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. The figure smirked, almost lovingly, and spoke with a tone of grim satisfaction. "You really didn't think we'd let you go that easily, did you?" His knees buckled, and he stumbled backward, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. His whole world had just been turned upside down, and the final twist was one he could never have predicted. The truth, the real truth, was far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Everything he thought he knew about himself, his life, his relationships, everything was a lie. And now, with these people closing in, he realized just how far they were willing to go to make sure the truth stayed hidden. As they took another step toward him, the shadows around them seemed to deepen, and he realized there was no way out. The game wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, the quiet hum of the night outside the warehouse doing nothing to ease the oppressive stillness inside. His breath was shallow, his mind reeling with the shock of the last few moments. The realization hit him with full force. The person standing in front of him, the figure he had once trusted, had been playing a game. One that he didn't fully understand, one that he had no idea he was even a part of. His heart raced, a familiar feeling of panic creeping in. He was trapped, caught in a web of deceit, manipulation, and confusion. And the more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed to find a way out. The figures in front of him weren't just strangers. One of them had been there in his life, maybe even closer than he ever realized. The face, that faint but unmistakable familiarity, it hit him like a punch in the gut. "How?" was the only word he could force from his lips. The figure who had once been a trusted friend smiled, a look of regret flashing across their features, but it was quickly replaced by cold, steely resolve. "You weren't supposed to know. You weren't supposed to figure it out." But he wasn't so sure anymore. The cracks in his understanding were becoming too large to ignore. Figure what out? Who am I really? What have you all been hiding? The room grew even darker as the second figure stepped forward, his face just as cold, just as unrecognizable. "The truth," he said simply, "is something you're not ready for. But now that you're here, there's no turning back." He took a deep breath, the weight of their words pressing down on him harder than ever. This wasn't some elaborate scheme for revenge, not the way he had imagined. This was far bigger than him, than his own personal pain or confusion. This was about a whole other level of manipulation, a web that stretched out further than he could have ever dreamed. The woman who had led him here, the one who had set everything into motion, remained silent. Her expression didn't change, and he wondered if she was simply waiting for him to break, for him to realize that he was already too far in. But he couldn't break. Not now, not when he was so close to the answers. "Tell me the truth," he demanded, his voice stronger now, a quiet rage bubbling up beneath the surface. "What have you done to me? What have I been a part of?" She stepped forward, her gaze unflinching. "You've been living a lie," she said, her words slow, deliberate. "Everything you've ever known, Everything you've ever been told was fabricated by us. We created you." His stomach churned. "Created me? What are you talking about? You weren't born the way you think." The second figure spoke again, his voice calm, almost clinical. "You were engineered, molded into someone else's image, a different life, a different reality. Everything about you was designed to fit into a narrative we needed, a narrative you've been living your entire life." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. His mind was reeling, spinning in a whirlwind of questions and confusion. "This can't be real," he muttered under his breath. "You're lying." "We're not," the woman said simply. "Everything you've known is part of a story we wrote, a story you've been living out. But now, it's time to wake up." His mind screamed for some sense of stability, some sense of normalcy. But it wasn't coming. The past, the memories, the faces, the people he had trusted, all of it was starting to feel hollow, like fragile pieces of glass that shattered when he touched them. "We've given you everything you need," the second figure said, almost as if they were trying to console him. "We shaped your life for a reason, a purpose. You've always been part of a bigger plan." It was like a light bulb had gone off in his head, but the truth felt more like a crushing weight than a revelation. A plan. He had always thought he was in control, thought that his choices were his own. But now, every decision, every moment felt like it had been directed by invisible hands. He stumbled backward, his head spinning. "No, this can't be. Why? Why would you do this to me?" She finally moved, taking a step closer to him. "Because you were needed. Because the person you were meant to be wasn't enough for the world we envisioned. But the person we've made you into, he's powerful. He's exactly what we need." Her words didn't sink in immediately. His brain was too overwhelmed to process them. But slowly, ever so slowly, something began to click. Something in the pit of his stomach told him that he had been more than just a pawn in this game. He had been a creation, a tool designed for a greater purpose. The people around him, the ones he thought he could trust, they had manipulated his life from the beginning, shaping him into whatever fit their narrative. "You used me," he whispered, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "I was never real." "You're as real as you've ever needed to be," she replied, almost kindly. "We gave you a life. We gave you everything. Friends, family, purpose. But now you have to understand that this isn't about you anymore. This is about the future we've been building. And you, whether you want to accept it or not, are a part of that future." The finality in her voice made him feel small, like a child hearing the truth for the first time. He couldn't help but feel the walls closing in around him. The people he thought were his friends, his family, they had all been actors in a play that was written long before he had a say in it. But then, just as the weight of everything began to crush him, a new voice rang out from the darkness of the warehouse. "Is it true?" The voice was familiar, but it took a moment for him to place it. His breath hitched when he recognized it. A third figure emerged from the shadows, someone he thought he had lost long ago. It was someone from his past, a figure that had disappeared for years without a trace. But here they were, standing in front of him like a ghost, a silent part of the story he had never fully understood. "I had a feeling you'd be involved in this," the woman said to the newcomer, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with a mix of respect and regret. "But it's too late for you to change things now." The newcomer stepped forward, their eyes filled with a kind of sorrow. "It's never too late," they said, their voice steady. "You've pushed him too far. It's time for him to know the whole truth." "Then tell him," the woman said, almost impatiently. "Tell him what he really is." The newcomer took a deep breath, their face a mask of emotion. "You weren't just a tool in our hands," they said, turning to face the man. "You were the one we were waiting for, the one who could change everything. You're not just part of the plan. You are the plan." He froze. The words were like a bomb, exploding in his mind. His entire existence, his entire purpose, had been built around him, unknowingly fulfilling a greater destiny. The weight of his role, of his purpose, pressed down on him like 1,000 pounds. "You were meant to be the key," the newcomer continued, their voice filled with quiet urgency. "Not just for us, but for everyone. You're the one who can bring it all together." "Bring what together?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What are you talking about?" "The world," the figure said simply. "The future we've been working toward. The change that's coming. You're the one who can make it happen." Everything he had known, everything he had thought he was working toward, had led him here. He was not a victim of fate, nor had he been a pawn in someone else's game. He had been the game all along. And now, the decision was in his hands. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint rustling of the night air. There was no going back. No more running. The moment had arrived. The truth was no longer a burden. It was a choice. And it was his to make. As he stood there, in that cold, dimly lit warehouse, the pieces of his life, the truth of his existence, finally came together. The future wasn't some distant concept. It was happening now. And for better or for worse, he was at the center of it all. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for sure. There would be no more lies. There would be no more manipulation. And as for his place in the world, he would decide that too. The future was his to shape.